Welcome to the Northland Bass Podcast with fishing guide John Myrie and bass tournament angler Ken Melander. On the Northland Bass Podcast, we cover everything bass fishing for both largemouth and smallmouth here in the Wisconsin Northland and all across the northern tier of Midwest states. Hello, folks, and welcome to another edition of the Northland Bass Podcast with myself, John Myrie, and co-host Ken Melander. And Ken, you're on a road trip, so we're doing this over the phone line this time.
Yeah, I'm up in Bemidji, Minnesota, checking the lakes around here.
Well, let's talk about the fishing right now. You know, we're post-spawn on almost all the lakes. You might find someplace that maybe didn't drop their eggs, but we're post-spawn, and water temperatures, though, actually are quite a bit lower than what I expect for this time of year.
Well, we've had so much rain, around Hayward, and even the whole state of Minnesota has gotten rain and a lot of cloud cover in the last 2 weeks.
I know, and we're still looking at water temperatures in that mid to high 60 degree range, and normally we're looking over 70 on a lot of the smaller lakes by now.
Well, that makes fishing a little better too, because a lot of the fish are, they're in, say, a water body average is 25 feet. They're going to be in 10 feet and less.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk a little bit about largemouth bass first. I mean, the areas, we concentrate a lot on smallmouth bass, but we've got some really good largemouth bass fishing up here too. And, there again, we're talking post-spawn fish, and, location is going to start changing there a little bit, isn't it?
Well, most of the time, the largemouth hang around the sunfish beds. You can use side image and forward-facing sonar, you can't see them as much, but 360 and side image, you can locate a lot of them sunfish beds, and any weed growth around those areas, the largemouth seem to hang around and be opportunists, because there's so many different insects and little minnows that go to rob the sunfish eggs, so it creates a little ecosystem there as far as predator-prey relationships, and the largemouth there just take advantage of it.
Yeah, if you haven't got bluegills pecking at your plastic worm or your bait, I mean, you probably haven't got too many largemouth. That is, I always find where I'm always getting nibbled on by bluegills before I catch largemouth. Yeah,
I've never witnessed this, but I would think that crawdads would go in and eat those little eggs too.
Yeah. Well, there's a wide variety of forage out there for them now. And we've had a lot of bug hatches going on. We've had some dragonflies pop up, and we're starting to see mayfly stuff showing up. Not to mention all the minnows and all the fry that's out there. So that food base is really getting ramped up out there. And that makes a difference too, as far as the bite windows where they're active really sometimes shorten up. You got to get to the point where you got to drop it right on the fish sometimes.
Yeah, there are times, though, post-spawn topwater works really good for largemouth. I'm a jig angler, so I always throw, jig at them, skirt a jig with a plastic craw trailer. And sometimes you want to use a really wide claw action like the rage craw, and sometimes you want to go with the chitter craw that kind of tightens it up. And then sometimes if you're going to move it fairly aggressive, you can put a Rage Menace on it, where it really tightens up the action.
And if all else fails, you can always go back to just an unweighted Cinco worm or just a wacky rigged worm. They always seem to produce action.
Yeah, and then once that shallow bite kind of tunes down, from the inside weed line into hard bottom spots on the shallow flats, that jig worm is phenomenal on a weed line.
Well, and you're mentioning the weed line thing too, and I've seen this. If you got a lake that has a pretty high walleye population, you've got a bunch of predators out there. It seems like if you get fish out on that outer weed edge or those deeper weeds, they're usually going to be your bigger largemouth bass. A lot of the bass will stay on that inside weed edge or along shoreline cover, down trees, wood, lily pads, and all that kind of stuff. But once you start getting where you have a lower density population of other predators, like walleyes, for instance, you'll start to see a lot of them fish, even the smaller ones, gravitate out to them deeper breaks, them deeper weed lines. You see that same thing too?
Yeah, whitefish chain. I've spent quite a few days on that lake. Whitefish over there by Brainerd. There'll be certain sections of the lake that will be dominantly walleyes on the weed line, and then there'll be some sections where it's largemouth. So depends upon, the bottom composition and where the ecosystems are a little different, because walleyes and bass, even sometimes smallies, prefer different substrates and depth contours where they're going to navigate up and down the weed lines.
Well, and where you start at, I always will start out shallow, and I'll start working out from there usually, because if I can find active fish up shallow, I'll stay with that pattern.
Yeah, like for instance, on Le Coudray, right there in Hayward, has a lot of walleyes. You don't catch the bass on the weed lines too much, but if you get on the flats, they have a lot of flats there. You catch some pretty big largemouth on the flats that you usually don't see no walleyes up that shallow until nighttime.
Yeah, they don't mix with the walleyes so as well as smallmouth do. Smallmouth will kind of cohabit together, a lot of type of structure.
Yep, usually the smallmouth will be slightly shallower than what the walleyes are using. So if the walleyes are in, 32 feet, the smallies will be in 24, 25.
Well, as far as lures, Ken, we talk about different lures and presentations for largemouth. A favorite always seems to be people want to throw topwater in. That, what dictates to you when you should switch and go to topwater over a spinnerbait or a worm or a jig or something?
Well, the easiest topwater bait is throwing a weedless frog up in the shallows, because there's going to always be shallow fish. It's just like us people. Some people like the concrete jungle and some of us like the forest. Well, if you like the busy life, go throw a frog up in the lily pads, even in the reeds, thicker reeds. Early mornings usually really good, and then sometimes midday when the sun's getting really high. So if you're in a pad bay and you hear the sunfish popping the pads, what they're doing is they're eating midges underneath the pads. And if you find a pad bay that has a lot of holes in the pads, especially going on all summer long, there's usually bass in there eating those sunfish.
Well, and when you're talking that type of scenario too, I find it a lot more productive not to be in there just kind of randomly casting. I'll be looking constantly for any pockets, holes, openings, because those seem to be the more productive areas if you got a pocket or a hole in the weeds rather than try to throw. And there are times when they're right up in the garbage too.
Yeah, well, fish in general are edge oriented, just like whitetails are. So if you look at the migration routes, some fish will come from the deep and go out there to sit for the day, and they're ambush predators. So edge, whether it be a tree, lily pad clumps, lily pad root, a little depression, any little subtle changes up there can create an opportunity for a fish to be sitting there.
Well, especially when you get into talking, lily pads and those type areas, be it super shallow areas of the lily pads, there's always, it's not just a flat bottom. There's always a bunch of holes and pockets, it seems like, in those areas.
Yeah, well, every year, it depends upon the ice depth. If you have a lot of wind that's pulling that ice around, it'll flip over those lily pad roots that they can be quite large at times, and it creates some depressions up there in the flats.
Yeah,
especially. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the fish will be on them a lot of times, or in those pockets or holes.
Yeah, especially the really big ones. There's a lot of times anglers will throw right to the bank, and they'll catch a 4 or 5 pounder, and they can't believe that fish was there because they just don't realize that those pockets are back there right next to the bank, especially when the water starts to rise. We've had a lot of rain in this area around Hayward, and then not so much in Bemidji right now, but a lot of southern part of the state. Those fish will go up shallow just because of the oxygenated water.
Well, there's a lot of other presentations too, and the big one people always seem to go for is a spinnerbait. The one tip I can give people on a spinnerbait is don't normally just throw it out and wind it in. You want to stop, stutter your reel, stop your reel, pause, let that bait get some vertical as well as the horizontal to it. But there's other presentations. I mean, we hear about all kinds of things out there. You got Ned rigs and you got the plastic worms I mentioned earlier, and there just seems like there's always a new presentation somebody comes up with.
Yeah, there's certainly, especially with technology advancing, there's always new techniques being developed by different companies.
Yeah, and sometimes you got to get right in the weeds in some of those presentations. Like I've actually tried that Tokyo rig, and I find that actually works pretty well around milfoil where it's really nasty thick stuff, because you can get right down to the base of this stuff and shake your worm a little bit pretty quick.
Yeah, I like throwing a half and 3/4 ounce jig right in the cabbage, especially early in the morning. Very, very good presentation. I keep it simple, just black blue.
Well, we're going to talk about smallmouth bass here too, and maybe some tips on one of our world-class smallmouth bass fisheries up here. We want to talk about one of our sponsors here, Hayward Lakes Visitor and Convention Bureau. Hayward Lakes is an interesting area. It's it's a 4-season area, a wilderness vacation destination, and they've got so much stuff going on here. You've got outdoor activities, fishing, boating, hiking, hunting, ATV, snowmobile. I could go on. There's just so much stuff to do here, and there's even several world-class events up here. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in Hayward at any one time during the year. And as far as the fishing and boating out there, Sawyer County alone has 495 lakes with over 56,000 acres of water, not to mention the rivers and streams. And some of the rivers, we're talking the Chippewa River, the Flambeau River, and the Namakogan River, which a lot of people call Wisconsin's moving national park, because it is a national park. So there's something for just about anybody that enjoys the outdoors here in the Hayward area.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I moved there from Minnesota.
Same here. Anybody looking for information on Hayward too, you can go to our website. So you got stuff on my website, from Wisconsin Northland Outdoors, or you can go to their website, which is haywardlakes.com, and you can order your free vacation guide from there and get all sorts of information. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, and it's a great place to stop by and visit.
It sure is. And not only largemouth fishing is probably a secret around here, but the smallmouth angling is, on the national average, I think it's way above average. It can be really good at times.
Well, yeah, it is, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But, I had a chance the other day on the phone to talk to Brian BRO Brosdahl over in northern Minnesota, over in that Grand Rapids area. Brian, or Bro, everybody calls him. Bro's a friend of mine, and he fishes for just about everything, and he fishes smallmouth bass quite a bit. I had a chance to talk to him about smallmouth bass fishing, and he had some pretty interesting things to say.
Yeah, he's got so many days on the water. I mean, a lot of experience to share with the listeners.
Well, let's hear that interview ahead with Bro, and we'll come back and we'll be talking about smallmouth bass right here in Sawyer County and Hayward in northern Wisconsin.
All right, John, we'll talk to you in a bit.
On the Northland podcast this week, we've got fishing guide and pro angler BRO Brosdahl over in northern Minnesota. And Bro, I know, as we get into the open water season here, one of the things that you seem to get after once in a while over there, more often than I probably want to think about, is the smallmouth bass, and that's getting to be a increasing thing as far as interest in fishing for them all across the northern part of the states here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And the smallmouth bass are really a little treasure for northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, because most people fish for the eater walleye or panfish, something that they can put on a stringer. And smallmouth bass are just a fighter fish. They're a fighter fish that jumps, and people visiting the area are surprised how good the bass fishing is up north. That's phenomenal, because they were basically untouched for years, and the lake populations are doing well. And with rusty crayfish are on the rise in our area, and they do rise and fall and sometimes disappear, but right now they're gorging on them and they're getting huge, and we're having lakes like Leech Lake show up with some true honest-to-goodness 5-6 pounders, and Mille Lacs, same. Mille Lacs kind of proved itself, and the Bassmaster and other tournaments came there, and people come back. They love it. Big smallmouth bass are a hit.
Well, crayfish are a big thing when it comes to the forage on them, and the rusty crays, we've seen it over here. We went through a cycle where we still got some world-class fisheries, but you had a ton of those rusty crays out there. You had a bunch of really big smallmouth too, because they just feast on them things, I think.
Absolutely. And if some of our biggest smallmouth bass lakes have rusties, and it's really created that. Plus, rusty crayfish create some big perch in lakes over here that have rusty crayfish. Lake of the Woods has them, Vermilion. They're in Pokegama and Grand Rapids. They're on Leech Lake, Cass Lake, Lake Winnebagosh. Pretty much all those lakes have big perch and big smallmouth bass, and so it's a good protein. It's a good forage for them, and they do molt where they lose their shell. They walk right out of their shell, and so the fish will go around and check to see if it is one of those, because literally when they lose their shell, you only have they start getting a hard skin in like an hour, 2 hours. By 12 hours, they got a hard shell again. So the fish kind of scour the bottom looking for those really soft, delicious treats.
What would be your number one bait that you would go for catching smallmouth? If you had to pick one lure out of everything out there for the whole season, what would be your go-to?
Oh, I absolutely love throwing marabou jigs. If I had to pick one thing, I like marabou jigs. They really make the smallmouth mad. They just attack them. They think they're a leech. They hit them and they stay hooked. Where big baits, big noisy baits are fun. A popper, whopper, plopper, spinner bait, all that stuff. Yeah, noisy, fun, keeps you interested. But that marabou, it zips them and they stay hooked. And some of the biggest fish in the lake get on them. But I have my rods that I roll through, and I roll through marabou on tough bites. I mean, if they're going to eat, I'm topwater all the way for sure, if I know that they're on. So I'll use, like I said, any kind of topwater just to watch them go crazy on it. But I'll use wacky worms, kind of produce fish when nothing else will sometimes. Jerk baits are fun. They can throw them, even if you put some different hooks and everything, but jerk baits get them riled up, and then you follow it up with a marabou in, different colors. Black has always been good, brown, pink. The feathers never stop moving, so you can even hold it still and they'll hit it.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because some of the best smallmouth bass fishermen in North America I've talked to, they all come up marabou jig. I mean, it is the answer, I think.
It is, and
not always.
Not always, though, because I do have lakes over here that have nothing. You can't take a smallmouth. They have to be over 20 inches to harvest, and people really don't take them. But you still got to have the slack, because some people think bass are food, from where they come from when they're up visiting. So you got to have that. But those lakes have big bass, and they get pressure. Well, marabou may not work there, but I could tell you what. A wacky worm is always going to work, and also, using a Ned rig. Really hard for me to throw something that looks like the leftover piece of a jig crawler, but I actually know where it came from. Ned Kitey, it was named after him. When he would do a jig worm and snip the top off, he saved all those tops and started fishing with them, and just outfished everybody. So, and then he's down in Oklahoma. He wrote for In Fisherman. I've done some articles with him, and it's amazing what a simple thing will do. But you put that on a stand-up head, and it's rock and roll. And Ned rigs are just basically look like a cigar butt. They've called them TRDs for a reason.
Yeah.
But that Ned rig, it's crazy. I always think, like, when I'm at the bass tournaments, here's a bunch of adults with really super expensive boats fishing for money, and they got that on their line, and I just get a chuckle out of it. But story after story, it gets their big fish, or it just fills the bag. So the Ned rig is another one of those things, and so all kinds of different little caveats on things can change things. Even Gussie, moping with a plastic fluke style bait, that's something I just can't get it to go here, but I could pitch it and use it real light with a weighted Gamakatsu worm hook on a white fluke. Works really well, or even a paddle tail.
On a side note on the Ned rig thing is they catch walleyes too. One of the guides up here told me a couple of years ago he had somebody get in the boat and he offered, he said, "Oh, we're throwing this," and the guy said, "No, I'm going to use my Ned rigs," and he outfished everybody in the boat that were fishing walleyes with, and he was throwing nothing but a Ned rig.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah,
that's just how it is. And I've caught them many times, and I don't do. I'm not a touring bass pro, but I jump in a few tournaments on the border there just to chase around to catch smallmouth bass, an excuse to hit the throttle and go fast and hang out with some cool people. And but along the way, when you're bass fishing, I catch so many walleyes fishing for bass and pike up and over 40 inches, and even a muskie last year in the tournament. I got a 52 incher, pulled it up, gave it a measure by the side of the boat, and that's approximate. I don't want to mess around with them too much, but I wanted to measure them.
Yeah.
And you just don't know what you're going to catch because you're throwing stuff. It says bass tackle in a lot of the ads at these different shops, but it works for whatever bites.
Yeah.
And, so that's a key thing.
Well, bro, the one thing I want to kind of get out there too is though that, the big mistake I see, whether you're talking a Ned rig or you're talking a marabou jig or a hair jig, the one big mistake I see a lot of people make is they just fish it too aggressive and too fast. Either bait.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. The Ned rig is painstaking. If you're actually in a tournament or you're fishing and you really want to get fish, it's hard because you got to let that thing just sit there and move it a little bit. And that's the thing. That's like the jig worm, eye candy jig worm, and designed for walleyes, eye candy. But I use that in a smallie tournament. It floats. So when you have a tungsten jig head, a little flat mushroom head, or a stand-up jig head, like a tungsten jig head, you could make that thing, you can wiggle it across the bottom, and you're making a walk on the head. And in a lot of times when the pressure's low, they'll just pick it up, and your line's going sideways. You don't even feel a bite.
That's something pretty much the same as just a little bit longer than a Ned, but the same as a Ned rig principle. Oh
yeah, absolutely. And but that floating bait makes a big difference in even in their the minnow forms. Everything floats. All eye candies float. The pan candy that's coming out, they have some samples over there in Park Falls at St. Croix. A lot of them sold the pan candy because it was a limited release. And it all floats, and it's just soft and real mushy, so it really comes alive in the water.
Yeah, in just about anything. I mean, whether you're talking Z-Man stuff or anybody else, Rapala's got some stuff out there. If you want, if at all possible, the material, it's actually called TPE plastic. You don't want to mix it with your other plastic because it turns to glue. But that plastic will stand up. It floats, and the jig head stands up, tail up on the bottom when you're trying to work a net in, and that's your best part of your presentation, I think.
Absolutely, and I have a lot of little tricks I throw at everything all the time. But making it stand up there, or just having something just pause for a second, really gets a bass agitated, and every little thing adds up. And I still throw spinner baits. I'll have tandem spinner baits whenever I'm on rivers or rip-rappy shoreline. You can really wake up a bass fast. And then if I'm using topwaters, I'll oversize them because, if you're really looking for a kicker, that's the way to go. If you want numbers, go small in the topwaters. But I like to make a lot of noise, and you're there to disrupt them. And, of course, I've caught walleyes on topwaters, so I don't know what they were thinking.
I know, one of the things I look for is once we start getting into the past the spawn, and you start getting where you got some dragonflies starting to fly around out there eating your mosquitoes up. It seems like that's about the time you want to pull out the topwaters for sure, and you get a nice sunny flat day with not very little wind, and in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 feet of water, these smallies will be in there thick, and you can catch them, and it's a blast catching them on that topwater.
Oh, absolutely. Submergent glide baits are also good, and just twitching them, and it's a lot of work, but you really got to get it going either light twitches, but sometimes you have to wake them up, make that minnow walk it in a spastic way where it's left, right, left, just get that thing moving all over the place. And, a really good submergent glide bait, if you pause for a second, it'll go for a ways and then just sit there in neutral. And sometimes just sitting there gets those fish to explode on it, or the next time you twitch it, they hit it. But one thing I found, the heavier the bait, the faster they can throw it.
Oh, yeah.
So
it's about the same thing with any type of a jerk bait or presentation. It seems like there's times when they'll go after it when it's just constantly ripping, but a big chunk of the time, it's the pause that gets them. I mean, that pause, and sometimes as the colder the water gets, the longer that pause needs to be between your twitches.
Oh, absolutely. And when you get into the Great Lakes, they got gobies there, and so anything plastics near the bottom, the Ned rig really kind of covers the goby, and other lakes, that Ned rig looks like crayfish, but, it doesn't have to be exactly that shape. It does look like a crayfish, and there's a lot of different sub shapes coming out of that genre. But I tell you what, all the different plastics, a pig and jig still works for really big ones if you're on those light weed edges. And look at Easton there on Leech Lake. He was pitching up in 2 feet of water with micro stuff and sealed the deal on the qualifier.
Yeah. Well, bro, a lot of interesting stuff there. We're going to have to get you back on here again sometime here talking about summer fishing for bass, but we'll talk about largemouth because, we kind of ignored that. We're talking smallmouth pretty much on this thing, but we've also got some pretty decent largemouth fishing up north up here too.
Absolutely. I had one guy tell me he went to a dock and pitched under it, and he said there was a fish under every dock. And he said, doesn't anybody fish for largemouth up here? I said, not really, not too many. And he couldn't believe how good the fishing was.
Well, bro, a lot of interesting stuff, great stuff. You want to let people out there know where they can follow you on social media and stuff, and interesting stuff on your guide business?
Yeah, go to brosguideservice.com if you want to book a trip, or just watch the Bro Road Show. I'm there spring and fall, on the change of the seasons, and we talk about tips and tactics to catch fish.
You bet. Well, bro, thank you for coming on here on the Northland Bassin Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, John. You have a great day.
Well, Ken, we're back after talking to Bro, and Bro's always an interesting guy. I get him on the radio show all the time and sometimes on the podcast because a very interesting, very informative guy. He also has his own internet stuff and a lot of social media. But talking about smallmouth bass, okay, we're post-spawn again on them, and there the location changes quite a bit because it goes from shallow to deep, but then you can usually find some fish shallow too.
Even in the middle of the summer, you can find them smallmouth really shallow, and, Bro, he talked about showing that marabou jig. And, one thing to realize is, like, I notice a lot of anglers fish it too fast. So they'll take an 8-to-1 gear ratio reel and think they're going to reel it at a slow speed. Well, they're too far off the bottom. You want to keep that, 6 inches to a foot off the bottom. And if you're just starting out, it takes a lot of discipline, and you reel the bait. You don't use your rod. Sometimes you can stop it and tap your rod and you'll fluff up that marabou and let it drop to the bottom and then just reel it really slow. But usually it's a slow moving bait. So a lot of anglers, they lift their rod and they've moved it 5 feet off the bottom and then they start reeling, and it's like the technique is designed for, kind of like the Ned rig, only the Ned rig, you can crawl it along the bottom, where the hair jig, you want to move it just a little bit.
Well, you made a good point there. The big rage is always faster and faster reels, and a lot of 8 to 8.1, 8.2 to 1 reels out there now. And I see that a lot, even in muskie fishing. Guys are just moving too fast with this stuff. They don't realize they're picking it up. But a lot of those reels will pick up, almost 3 feet of line for a crank. They pick up a lot of line real quick. So that bait's really moving. A lot of times it's moving way too fast for what you should be doing.
Well, with smallmouth being really curious, you need to keep that bait in the strike zone all the time. So they're curious and they'll keep following it. And, same thing with any bait that makes a little bit of bottom contact. if the water's clear, they'll come from 50 feet away just to investigate. But if you take and rip it off the bottom too fast for this type of presentation, they'll just turn and float a different direction. But on the other hand, at times when you're running a tube and you're snapping your tube really high, but it has to be a heavier weight. It can't be like a flu drop. It has to drop pretty fast, and then you get a reaction bait out of smallmouth. So smallmouth are finicky on each given day on what they want. So you have to experiment with reaction baits, and then go with techniques, whether or not they want a really slow dragging motion, which my favorite for smallmouth for every day out of the year, no matter when, where, when, what, where, why, any given body of water, is throwing a football head inside of a 3.5-inch tube. And as long as it's green pumpkin and has some purple, or you can go with green pumpkin with red or green metal flake, and just dragging that football. But don't drag it with your rod. You drag it with your reel, because you need your rod set at like 10:30 so you can set the hook right away.
Yeah, perfect small crayfish imitator. The tube has always been a great bait, and it always will be a good bait. Now, let's talk a little bit about smallmouth location out there. We've got big lakes here that have world-class smallmouth. We've got other lakes that have a good, healthy population of smallmouth bass in them. Maybe not quite as big, but there are some big fish present there too. But you've got flowages, you got clear natural lakes, and there's a big difference in where you're going to find those smallmouth in the midsummer on the different types of lakes, isn't there?
Yeah, yes, there is. If there's ciscos in the lake, you can, like the walleyes, they'll go out in the main water body and just suspend and float around them. And then they'll also do the same thing where there's a lot of baby perch. You'll see clouds and clouds of baby perch out there in that deep water. So that usually happens like third week in July to the second or third week in August, where they'll be out there in no man's land.
Yeah, and when you're talking flowages or reservoirs, they tend to be, I've had guys say, well, I fish them like largemouth because they're under stumps, logs, up against shore, relatively shallow normally, around docks and stuff.
Yeah, well, they like to see where they're going. They ain't going to be out there suspending that deep water too much.
Yeah.
And, like even on the flowage, there's a lot of weed smallies, and you can catch them real big ones. And, on the east side, there's a lot of eelgrass. And that eelgrass, you got to throw like a little Texas rig. I like throwing the baby brush hog, green pumpkin candy, and I'll spike a little bit of the tail, like 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, with chartreuse, just to give them a little color and action.
Well, we mentioned lakes that have world-class smallmouth with big smallmouth, and they've got them. There's lakes that have those in North Dakota now. We've got northern Minnesota, here in northern Wisconsin, up in the UP. There's a bunch of lakes we're in a perfect zone for growing, for them lasting enough years to get big, and the growth rate on them and everything else. Here in the Hayward area, we've got a handful of lakes that are managed with a 1-fish limit. They got to be over 18 inches. They're managed as trophy smallmouth waters. And we've got Grindstone, we've got Coudray, we've got Round Lake. Those are all, and then up north, we've got some other lakes too. The Eau Claire chain has some big smallmouth, but we've got quite a few. But right here in Sawyer County, we've got 3 major ones, right?
Yep, and then you got Lake Owen too. It's got some big ones.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of places up here. And, when we're talking about fishing them, let's pick one lake. Okay. Let's say Round Lake. Okay, if people are looking for smallmouth out on Round Lake, where are you going to start? There's a lot of rock structure in that lake, a tremendous amount of rock structure. There isn't all 3 of the big lakes we're going to talk about, but we'll talk about some of the other lakes on another podcast. But right now we're going to pick Round Lake. Somebody's up here, give them a good tip on, where do they start at?
The deeper flats, that have 8 to 10 feet on top. Them smallies, even with the scattered weeds, there seems to be more Eurasian milfoil on the lake that hasn't been 25 years ago. So there is a weed population. We've had a few derbies out there, and smallies can get caught in the weeds too, up on the flats. But so some days they'll be up there in that 4 or 5 feet. If you're really stealth, you can see them swimming down there. And the marabou jig will work really good, a tube, and then some small swim baits up on the flats can catch them.
There's a lot of rock structure, rock bars out there too, especially up in the north end of the lake, and sometimes they're on those, but not always. Especially as we get later in the season, they'll kind of gravitate toward a lot of them rock bars, rock humps, and rock bars.
A lot of those rock humps got rock going down to 22, 23 feet. So they can be anywhere from 10 to 23 feet. And Ned rig works really good out there.
Yeah, cribs too. There's a ton of cribs in that lake because 45 years ago when the rusty crayfish got in there, they pretty much wiped out the weeds and there wasn't a lot of weeds, so there was a ton of cribs put in there, and now we've gotten weeds and we've got Eurasian milfoil too. But so all of the above, I mean, the cribs still hold fish too.
Yeah, there's a lot of cribs. I think the last group of cribs they put in them plastic ones, so they're kind of white. They stand out pretty well, and they hold a lot of the smaller minnows and stuff, and the smallies will swing in there for a meal, but they don't sit on them as well as they do on the wooden timbered ones.
Well, Ken, a lot of great information there. We're talking with a bunch of stuff there. And again, we've mentioned the Hayward Lakes Visitor and Convention Bureau. They got an information booth there, which got a ton of information as far as anything you want to know. And I know there's a lot of good lakes up here, and if anybody's looking for information, they can find it real quick on the internet, haywardlakes.com, and on our website, my website at WISCNorthlandOutdoors.com.
There is a trend that, a lot of anglers are trying to learn techniques and that for largemouth and smallmouth because it's just the opportunities for fishing up here can be great for them.
Oh, it's growing and expanding, more so than I've ever seen it because it's a healthy fishery. We've got a ton of them, and it's mostly people are practicing catch and release, but the bass fishing is great for largemouth and smallmouth.
You could take some of them kayak anglers that come into town and go to these small lakes, and they'll never want to leave that lake. The fishing is so good.
Well, Ken, we're going to wrap up this podcast here. A lot of good information there. Hopefully everybody out there enjoys it. If you enjoyed it, podcast, please share it and like our podcast, and we'll be back again with another one here in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about different lakes and maybe what's going on as far as the timing and presentation some more.
Yeah, if you listeners, if you want us to talk about equipment or rods and reels, just give us a post on Podbean, and we'll try to get your questions answered here on the show.
Yeah, I should make a point on that, too. You just did. If they go to Podbean, the podcast is available on Spotify and everything else, but it's hosted on Podbean. That's podbean.com. And if you go there, the web address for our podcast is northlandbassin.podbean.com. If you go there, there's a comment section. You can leave comments, ask questions, and we'll get back to you on it.
Yeah, I appreciate any feedback in regards to the podcast, because we just good old guys that have a lot of time on the water, and we're just getting together and, trying to bring some information to the listeners.
And share some of it. So anyway, Ken, I want to thank you greatly, and you drive safe on that road trip.
All right. Thanks, John.
Well, folks, that about wraps up this edition of the Northland Bassin Podcast. If you'd like more information on the Hayward, Wisconsin area, check out the Wisconsin Northland Outdoors Radio Show on our other podcast channel, wnoradio.podbean.com, or for even more information on the web at haywardlakes.com or wnoradio.com. Thanks for listening, and watch for our next Northland Bassin Podcast. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe to the channel.